109th contact, Thursday, June 8, 1978, 6:14 p.m. Billy says, human children, you have rushed me far away. Semjase says it had to be, unfortunately. You see, today, the military is in the wide surroundings. Billy says these birds have somehow been maneuvering already for days. Quetzal says we will let you back down to earth even further away. Look, over there. Billy says, man alive, that is, indeed, even further away than Skoenberg. Semjase says, sure, we were there once, at an earlier time. It must be, however, because safety comes first. Billy says, I also have nothing to object to that. But tell me, girl, the apple there beside the viewing screen, have you stolen that from somewhere? Semjase says, no, it belongs to my provisions. Billy says, where did you get it, then? Did you buy it somewhere? Semjase says, no, not that either. It comes from the drifting gardens of my father. Billy says, you mean that it is from Papa's giant box, that it grew there and was harvested? Semjase says, definitely. Billy says, aha, then you also have such fruits, as we know them here on Earth. Semjase says, sure, but they weren't originally native fruits of Era. The apple is from a tree, which comes from a progeny of earthly trees. Billy says, oh, I see, so you have fruit trees that were taken from the earth, which you simply continue to cultivate, and you also let these bloom and bear fruit in your great spacer. So what kinds of trees do you have, then? Semjase says we possess trees, shrubs, and plants of every kind, as they also exist on the earth. There are even various kinds in our drifting gardens, which have already been extinct on the earth for a very long time. But we have preserved them and have made them useful to us. Thus, we have all fruits, as they are also known on the earth with you, and even several more, which you only know through your researches of antiquity, etc. Billy says that is fantastic. And how do these fruits taste today with you? Do they still have the same taste, as we know it? Semjase says, you think now of this apple. Sure, the taste has remained the same. It is, perhaps, even somewhat more intense than with your apples of this sort, and certainly much better in its juice. But all the other fruit trees from the earth also bear fruits with the tastes or flavors known to you. It's just that these, as I've already explained, have become somewhat more intense, since our robots and androids maintaining the trees work on these very attentively and also have great concern for them, as this happens with all plants cultivated by them. Billy says, and that apple there, it necessarily has to lie there if you don't want to eat it? Semjase says. Quetzal says, ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha. You don't understand him, but I do. Even very well. Semjase says, I? Billy says, I mean, is it absolutely necessary that this apple lies there so lonely and isn't eaten? It looks so nice and, thus, appetizing. Semjase says, I want to eat it, yes, but only later, when I might be hung. Ah, I understand. Of course, sure, you can have it. Just eat it, if you feel like it. Oh, how silly of me. Billy says, only half as bad, girl, but I really was alluding to that. But I wouldn't like to eat it right now, but maybe once I'm on the way home again. Until then, I could probably cope with an apple. Semjase says, sure, it should be yours. Billy took the large apple and brought it home with him, where he handed it over to Guido Musprugo, who then inserted the apple into a glass of alcohol and made it durable in this manner. The apple still exists today and is still in the same glass under the care of Guido. Translators note this apple appears in the movie The Silent Revolution of Truth. www.scubly.com web link. Billy says, thanks, girl. But now, look here, may I read this to you? Semjase says, what does it concern, then? Billy says a small excerpt from a book written by a man by the name of Martin Buber. Semjase says, then you better turn with the to Quetzal or to my father. If you want, can I establish a connection with him? Billy says gladly, if Quetzal is also involved then. It may, in fact, be very interesting to see what the two have to say to this. Quetzal says why? Billy says it concerns something specific. Quetzal says, what do you think about the writings of Martin Buber and about his mind games? Billy says, actually, I think that he reveals a philosophy that is often very wise, but which, in turn, operates completely unrealistically and even brings about dangerous errors. Quetzal says that is correct. Semjase says the connection to father is established. Patar says, you wish to speak to me, what does it concern, then? Billy says, I have a matter of concern, Patar. Here, this note. On it, there's an excerpt from Martin Buber, whose literature you evidently know all about, as Semjase told me just now. Patar says that is of correctness. Let's hear what you have. Billy says this concerns an extract from Images of Good and Evil, and it says because the human being is the only known living organism in which, to some extent, the category of possibility has embodied itself and whose reality is incessantly shrouded by possibilities, he needs, as the only one among all, confirmation. Each animal is established in being what it is, its modifications are predetermined for it, and when one changes itself into a caterpillar or into a pupa, its change is also a limit. All of this together is what it is, and thus, no confirmation can be necessary for it, so it would be an absurdity if someone said to it, or if it said to itself, you may be what you are. The human being, as a human, is a risky venture of life, undetermined and fragile, and therefore, he needs confirmation, and he can naturally only receive this as an individual human being by others and he himself confirming him in his being human. Over and over again, the yes must be spoken to him, from the view of the familiar and from the stirring of his own heart, in order to liberate him from the apprehension of being abandoned, which is a foretaste of death. If need be, one can do without confirmation from others if one's own self increases in such a way that he makes the supplements from others unnecessary. But not vice versa. The words of encouragement of others aren't sufficient if one's self-knowledge dictates the internal rejection, for self-knowledge is unquestionably more independent. Patar says, why have you brought up this erroneous and dangerous excerpt? Billy says, because I also find it erroneous and incorrect. Patar says, and what do you think about it? Billy says, I wanted to hear your opinion. Patar says, I also won't withhold it from you, but I wonder what your thoughts are on this excerpt. Billy says, then you should hear my opinion. I think that Martin Buber has actually brought forth very useful philosophical things, but that with these, very serious negative values appear, which are nicely and dangerously woven into the good and lawfully right facts. But now, this excerpt, which was brought to me by someone, and one also underlined this sentence here, appears to me to be such an unrealistic view that I wanted to bring it up with Semjase. I do think that the assertion is very wrong and dangerous, and to be sure, in reference to the modifications of animals compared to human beings. As I was taught, the modification does apply in relation to the animal, and thus also in relation to the change of its limit, but only in a relative sense, for an evolutionary change in the form of an adaptive change is also given with the animal. The change or limit is, thus, only set in the current course, but not in the future course. Diverting this fact toward human beings in a contrary to right sense seems so absurd and dangerous to me that I would like to have this excerpt be cleared up and clarified by you. I also think, in reference to this depiction, that humans are a risky venture of life, that it is quite malicious and injurious to creational law, that something like this can only ever be claimed, and Quetzal says with that, you make a very clear and truthful statement. Billy says, where was I? Oh yes, what I still wanted to say, for what is then said further, regarding the continual confirmation, the being abandoned, which should be a foretaste of death, etc., I have the view that this is even complete nonsense. Especially the being abandoned in the foretaste of death allow me to come to the acceptance that this Martin Buber was ranked among the mass of human beings afraid of death because Patar says that is of absolute correctness, regrettably, because the man could have done much greater and more valuable things if this fear wouldn't have been in him. But I interrupted you. Continue to state your remarks. Billy says thanks, Patar. The whole thing, in my opinion, boils down to this, that Buber was of the crazy view that human beings in their doings, actions, feelings, and thinking, etc., have to be confirmed always and continuously because they need this and can only grow in and of themselves through this. But to me, it also seems to follow from this that Buber was of the opinion that this was the only way that human beings could be upheld in their morale, which I perceive as totally wrong, however, even as crazy. The animal, in contrast to the earth human being, is very much geared toward independently recognizing and acknowledging its modifications in every respect, which gives it the security of its self-strength, its self-knowledge, and its self-confidence, making it very stable. This is so because it is correctly connected to the laws of nature, and these surge through it in an impulse-related manner. Now, the human being, who is fallen away from nature, effeminate and big-thinking in his thought forms, has long since forgotten how to align himself on self-knowledge, self-confidence, and on independence and self-cognition. Through this, he comes into the insanity situation, that he can no longer be confirmed, and through this, he falls victim to continuous low morale. But in order to make up for this in his delusion, he commonly creeps onto the unreal path of confirmation by his fellow human beings. This means that he becomes of the delusion that he must be confirmed by a constant, yes, from the view of the familiar and the stirring of his own heart, as Buber says really idiotically, allegedly in order to be freed from the apprehension of being abandoned, which should allegedly be a foretaste of death. Now, I really ask myself, how poor in truth the human being must be in himself, if he thinks and writes in this manner, whereby I cannot understand the whole thing, because Martin Buber, on the other hand, brought forth rather real, philosophical truth. Confirmation by others, this is just crazy and nothing but adulation, and this is only needed by human beings who still can't find any healthy self-confirmation or their self-knowledge, their self-strength, or their self-recognition. Just because of this, so I imagine, they must start to reap praise, in order to find confirmation through this. If they don't receive this confirmation, however, then their morale sinks away abysmally, they feel pushed away, ignored, and neglected. In addition to this, they increase in ideas and feelings that are absolutely foreign to the truth and to reality, until, slowly but surely, a mania develops from it, which ultimately expresses itself in an almost hopeless fantasy, that things actually are as they believe them to be. Already within a very short time, they cannot notice and cannot recognize any more that, as a rule, no change has been made by fellow human beings or has occurred with respect to the treatment, thinking, and actions toward them. They simply aren't able to recognize this anymore because they are no longer able to grasp the facts and the truth in their confirmation craze. Because of this, they cry out for praise. But if they have the power of a healthy self-confirmation in the lawful sense, then they themselves would know at any time whether what they did, thought, or undertook was and is of a right form and right measure, or whether it exhibits deficiencies, after which they could then act in this or that case, accordingly in self-cognition. If they are not able to do this, however, then they are still very backward in knowledge and in the recognition of truth in this regard, which, in turn, means that they deliberately resist themselves against the truth and knowledge because a certain egoism is owned by them and shows them that they would have more advantages this way or that they would be better promulgated through this. That is my view, Patar, but now, I would like to hear your opinion on this, as well as that of Quetzal and Semjase. Patar says I have nothing to add to your statements. Any further word would be superfluous because I wouldn't even have been able to explain that grew there and was harvested. Semjase says definitely. Billy says aha, then you also have such fruits as we know them here on Earth. Semjase says sure, but they weren't originally native fruits of Era. The apple is from a tree, which comes from a... Billy says these birds have somehow been maneuvering already for days. Quetzal says we will let you back down to Earth even further away. Look, over there. Billy says man alive, that is, indeed, even further away than Skoenberg. Semjase says sure, we were there once, at an earlier time. It must be, however, because safety comes first. Billy says I also have nothing to object to that. But tell me, girl, the apple there beside the viewing screen, have you stolen that from somewhere? Semjase says no, it belongs to my provisions. Billy says where did you get it, then? Did you buy it somewhere? Semjase says no, not that either. It comes from the drifting gardens of my father. Billy says you mean that it is from Pata's giant box, that it 109th contact, Thursday, June 8, 1978, 6:14 p.m. Billy says human children, you have rushed me far away. Semjase says it had to be, unfortunately. You see, today, the military is in the wide surroundings.